How's it going, ParaTruthers? Welcome to a brand new episode of ParaTruth Reborn. My name is Justin. Some toys are meant to be cuddled, but others carry a presence you can't explain. Dolls that whisper, stare, and even move on their own have terrified families for generations. So today we're talking to Fiona Dodwell about her book, A Cursed Collection of Haunted Dolls, to help guide us through on how to handle these toys. Fiona is a freelance journalist and author who has been fascinated with the paranormal since childhood. She studied theology, applied paranormal research, demonology, and exorcism, and has a particular fascination with haunted objects. Fiona, welcome to ParaTruth Reborn.
Thanks for having me on.
So a lot of people would ask, why haunted or cursed dolls?
It's just something that really gripped me. I guess it could go way back when you look at the Annabelle case in the 70s. That's obviously the first big case that gripped everyone. So I always had that story in my mind, and it was something that unsettled me. And then it was in 2015 when Peggy the doll made headlines across the mainstream media, when people began reporting feeling ill when they saw even just pictures of Peggy. So it was around that time, sort of 2015, where I kind of dive into the subject, and it's kind of like gripped me ever since, really. And I just spent a lot of time reading, learning, studying, and interviewing people who have experiences with it. And it's just been a really fascinating journey for me.
So what made you want to write the book about it?
I wanted to put something together that was a comprehensive guide to the subject, because what I know that there's a whole wealth of material out there for general paranormal things like haunted houses, poltergeist, demonic possession. I thought the whole subject and idea of a haunted object, whether it's a doll or an antique or a piece of jewelry, I thought that wasn't really an aspect of the paranormal that had been studied quite so much. There wasn't so much out there. So once I knew how interesting and fascinating that I found it, I just then decided I wanted to kind of collect everything that I'd been learning and one sort of the book so that other people would have a chance to read what I'd found, and then it's up to them to make their judgment really about how they feel about it or where they lean towards believing.
Okay. Now, how do you define a cursed or haunted doll compared to just one that has like a spooky backstory?
Yeah, I mean that's the big question, really, because I think Hollywood and or films, like the whole theme in horror in general, has given us this idea of a freaky doll that, you know, it can walk and it can talk, and it's very dramatic, and it almost kind of, in a sense, makes a caricature of the subject. And so I think people are really what the reality could actually be like. And I think you have to be careful as well, because you will find people online that probably take advantage a little bit. Oh, here's a spooky doll, and these are the creepy things that have happened. And, you know, you have to tread carefully. But I think the main way you can differentiate between a real haunted object or a haunted doll against one that isn't is time and experience. So somebody can give you a background and a history and plant those ideas in your head, but I think the best way you can verify that is your own time and your own experience. Much like you would with visiting a haunted property, you can hear all the legends around it that surround that place, but until you found that experience yourself to kind of validate or perhaps refute even, then it's hard to make that distinction. So I think it's a case of knowing what you're looking for and knowing what you're likely to experience with a haunted object, and looking for that yourself. If you come into contact with an object you think could be haunted, it's kind of working through that and seeing what you're finding with your own experience and senses.
Now, I mean, this is a fascinating subject for me just because of, I followed the Warrens' career as an adult. So it's interesting to, see the movies, read their books and stuff like that. And then, kind of learn some of the truths behind the cases, because both the books and the movies were a little dramatized a little bit. But what is your vetting process before you start looking at a case and interviewing people about whatever they're saying is haunted?
I think it's case by individual basis. So I spoke to some notable people, like from within the paranormal field, who had hands-on experience, and I knew that they'd had quite significant encounters. It's people like Jane Harris, for example, from Help My House is Haunted. I interviewed her and spoke to her about Peggy the doll, and you may be familiar with Harold the doll as well. He once made an appearance on Ghost Adventures, and his owner Anthony Quinata released a book on him. And that, these people had such a rich and varied significant experiences that I kind of wanted to pick their brains on it and get their experiences and their insight into what it was like, and also their insight and advice on what to look out for. But every case is different, so it was more a case of me reaching out, come across things on, this person's had this experience, or this person has an object that's done this, this, and this. So my main aim with the book was to reach out, speak to these people, kind of collate the information, write down what their experiences are, why they believe the object is haunted, and kind of condense that into the book, and then let the reader decide really how they feel about that. Because I can't, obviously, writing an account, I can't prove to people, much like anything in the paranormal. All you can do, I think, is your best by presenting what there is and letting people make up their own minds. So that's my viewpoint when I was putting the book together.
Okay. Now, are there any pieces of evidence, physical or behavioral evidence, that has been more compelling than others, or even misread?
I think one thing that I found particularly compelling was with, and I know it's a case that some of your listeners will probably be familiar with, it's one of the famous cases, but Robert the Doll. Obviously, there's been a lot of writing about him, articles, and even a series of films about Robert. And obviously, the background is that a maid had given the doll to a child of a family, and that the child became convinced that the doll was communicating with him, and the doll would move, and that some negative things were not necessarily negative, but some paranormal activity was certainly surrounding the household after being given the doll. And I think one thing I found quite compelling about this case is that, we often read about cases that are historical, and we can go back and see what people have experienced in the past, like with Annabelle. You hear these things and it's all secondhand information. But with Robert the Doll, one thing that's particularly interesting is that when people visit the doll in the museum, it's not uncommon for people to come away and feel like they've been affected, that they have some kind of bad luck or negative energy surrounding them after seeing him. And to the point the museum have actually said themselves, we're receiving mail quite regularly from visitors saying, we're sorry if we did anything to bring this on to, we're sorry if we did anything to disrespect Robert, and we apologize, and we just want to try and cut that connection. And that's not actually an uncommon thing. And so that was an interesting thing I thought that was quite insightful, because, it's an old case, but it seems to be having reverberations even now in sort of 2025. So that was one that stood out to me quite a bit.
Okay. Now, something that I've questioned quite a bit, and maybe people have done this or not, but have you ever come across people telling why they didn't just destroy the doll or get rid of it?
I come across that question a few times during my research of the subject. And I think one of the reasons, or one of the most significant reasons, is that people are frightened that because a spirit or an energy, whether it's something positive or demonic, I think people are frightened that it's not necessarily contained to that object. I think there's a worry there, much the same as perhaps with Ouija boards, where there's a bit of a superstitious belief. Perhaps if I destroy this item or if I burn it, is that actually going to make things worse? Is it going to unleash something further? Is it going to anger the spirit? So I think it's the attitude of not really knowing whether that would make something worse or not that perhaps makes people fear just going straight into action and damaging the item or throwing it out. Because it's new territory. We don't really know, just because an item has an energy attached, whether that energy actually needs to remain with that item or not. So it essentially might not even fix anything. So I think there's just that nervousness about what to do next. So I think most people, at least of what I've read about, are more comfortable speaking to somebody who has experience of dealing with objects like that, like a psychic or a medium or even a priest for blessings, something like that. They call on outside help more often.
Have you ever come across anybody that kind of has an idea why these attachments happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's I had a set of questions in my mind that I wanted to find answers to, and it includes things like, how does a doll become haunted? Why would an object have something attached to it? And so I kind of, during my writing book, I did speak to a lot of people. I did do a lot of reading, and I think there are a few theories, really. The most common theories about how an object would be haunted is that, particularly with a doll, there could be an energy that sees a doll and wants to tether itself to something that it sees as recognizably human. So, it makes sense, I suppose, if there is an ability of spirit to inhabit an object, it would seem likely they would want to be part of something that looks human, that has the facial features that might even resemble how they looked in life. There's another theory that suggests that perhaps that item itself was something that somebody owned and just loved, and so it absorbed some of that energy, almost like the stone tape theory, this idea that an item loved and kept for years just might absorb some of that energy from a person. And then you can go down the other route, was the doll used in ritualistic purposes? Was a curse used with that item, in which case it's not like a traditional haunting, it's more a case of somebody using that doll and putting to it with a direct purpose of causing an effect to somebody. But those are some of the ideas that I've come across, so the most common ones anyway.
Okay. Now, have you ever been able to debunk a doll story? And if you did, what tipped it off?
Well, the cases that I used in the book were the ones that the people that I reached out to, that I already researched enough to feel like there was some validity to it. So in that sense, in terms of the ones that I included in the book, I'd kind of already worked quite thoroughly through who I wanted to include in that situation. But just to touch upon that subject a little bit, it's not always a dishonest thing when people say, "Oh, I'm a haunted or cursed item, take it off my hands." I believe that some people just might genuinely believe that, or might have a series of events they attribute to, and might be a mistake. So, for example, one thing your question reminds me of is that during writing the book, someone reached out to me and they said, "Look, since I've found a doll in an attic," they were clearing out some space in their attic and they found this doll, and they said, "Look, nothing but bad luck has happened to me since finding this doll. It's really unnerving me. I don't want a lot of money or anything. Just, I'd be more than happy for you to take it off me." So maybe I was just completely stupid, but I said, okay, then, send it my way, and it'd be interesting to see if anything happens. So I was quite nervous, because I thought, I'm inviting this thing in, and that I might experience something similar, something negative. But I spent a lot of time once the doll arrived sort of doing my own investigation and trying to sort of explore whether there was any energy. And it's been sort of several months into it now, and there's not been a single thing or experience that I can put down to that doll. But in that case, I'd like to say I don't believe that person was trying to be dishonest. They seemed genuinely frightened that some bad luck that had happened to them was because of the doll, and they just wanted the doll gone. And they felt like by sending it to me that it would become my problem. But not one thing has happened since. So you have to ask that question then, was there something going on with that particular person rather than the object? And much to my relief, I haven't been plagued with luck owning it, but it's made a nice doll for my collection anyway. So.
Now, from that person, have you heard anything from them since, like, that they're still having that type of situation, or that activity has increased since the doll left?
That's an interesting question. Funny enough, I think because things have been so busy with promotion and when I was writing the book and everything, that it was in the back of my head to do that. I wanted to find out, and I haven't yet, but I'm hoping to sort of send a message over and just see if he has anything. It would be interesting to hear if things continued for them, or whether it completely stopped when the dog, one way or the other. It'd be good to know. So I haven't yet, but I plan to find out. So.
Okay. Now, there's so many questions that come to mind, but have you come across any cases where you can tell what triggered the activity or what woke up the doll?
That's quite a hard one to answer, because honestly, from a lot of the cases I have read, it seems to be a series of really but I mean, I'm somebody, because I've spent a lot of time reading and researching, I do believe that this can happen, and I do believe that dolls or objects can be spirited or haunted. But for the most part, I think most people, when they experience this, it's through a completely unsuspecting encounter. They've gone out to a shop, perhaps they've been to an antique fair, or they've just bought a vintage item on eBay, and it's quite a random thing that just kickstarts that series of events for them. I don't think there's often an actual specific trigger, but there might be in the past, something to link it to that might have been lost from previous owners, or the reason that the previous owner gave that item away, for example. But that's not something that it's been easy to uncover, unfortunately.
Okay. Now, have you ever come across a case that has like solidified in your mind that this is a true phenomenon? Like, were you a skeptic at first when you first started looking at these cases, or?
I was a believer in hauntings and in spirit because of my own personal experiences. So I leaned towards believing, but I always try to have that kind of centered approach where I go into the case or the subject and try to be led by what I'm learning and experiencing. So sort of like a believer, but with a healthy believer, a good dose of skepticism, not just necessarily believing because it's what I've been told or anything. So yeah, I don't just jump to each case with that mindset of just thinking, oh, this is really, written, must be true. I'm aware of that balance, much like in anything. But I just really wanted to answer the question that I think for a lot of people, I mean, if believe, might be going off a bit, but starting point was to think, if a house, like a building, a hotel, building a brick, plot of land, that's just soil and field, landscape can be, which many of us can, then the question is, why can the material a piece of jewelry not? And that's what's journey. Sorry, I think I'm off there, but that's just something that, the big thing to do anyway.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. Now you mentioned the one doll that somebody had sent to you, but are there any cases where the doll was removed and that resolved the activity, and then what happened next?
I know there were cases where activity after the doll. So obviously there's the famous that we know Annabelle doll, when Ed eventually became involved, removed Annabelle, and confirmed that it wasn't just the spirit of a child attached to this people looking for, that it was something demonic. They removed took her, put them in her in their museum, and I think that from all reports and everything that I could gather, that the activity settled for the owner of Annabelle in their home life. And much the same with Peggy the doll. There was this doll from the 50s, and they had really creepy event, and they were attached to and they put Peggy outside, placed her in a garden bed or an outbuild of their property. They didn't even want her. And then Peggy remained there until the owner, Jane Harris, you might recognize the name. She felt My House is Haunted over here in England. She's part of the show. She was called to her own, and she confirmed there was an energy attack Peggy, and it's quite a forceful one. Because as I mentioned earlier on in the show, there were people that even just saw pictures or footage of Peggy and were coming in like with their messages saying, "Oh, I felt really ill after seeing her," and all this, horrible negative feeling overtook me. And I think, Jane went in and did her thing and removed Peggy. And I think, as far as I know from all I've been able to learn, that activity settled after the removal of Peggy in the home that she was originally in. Now, whether anything has obviously, continued, I think eventually Zach Bagans took Peggy and she's now in the Haunted Museum. So obviously Peggy still might be doing her thing in her current location, but I think there's an indication that by removing these items, often the energy is moving with them.
Okay. Now, we've mentioned that, pop culture has kind of grabbed this idea and went with it. How much of this is just a fear of a creepy looking doll? Because, I mean, psychology wise, people will start seeing things, hearing things, just because fear is playing a factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably Hollywood hasn't helped in that sense either, because Hollywood's really adopted the whole killer doll trope. We have the 90s film Dolly Dearest that you might have seen, the doll, and obviously Child's Play with Chucky, and you have Annabelle, like, who was made kind of morphed into the horror character as we know her. And so we kind of adopted this fear through seeing these dolls become something really negative and demonic and dangerous. I really think it planted that idea in the public consciousness that, perhaps there could be something else at play with these items sometimes. So that's certainly been an influence on our attitude about dolls. But I think there's another side to it as well. I think it's the fact that two things really. One is that they are lifelike, and some more than others, but some are incredibly lifelike. Sometimes their eyes can really feel like they're looking at you and that they can be following you. Their facial features, there's something about looking at a human vessel, a human likeness, and having it in your room staring at you, that can be quite unsettling to people. And secondly, I think it's also the fact that everyone has or has had items like this in their home. You know, our children have dolls lying around, and our grandchildren, and we collect them, we put them on shelves in our house. And I think it's that as well that plays on our mind. You know, you see these films and you hear about things like the Annabelle case, and you just know that actually that could have been literally any doll at all, that these things aren't necessarily special, they're just an average doll. But you can never predict when something could be attached or become attached to it. And I think when you're thinking in those terms, it's not like moving into a haunted house. It could literally be a case of popping down the shops one day, seeing an item in at a market or a charity store, and picking it up, and then suddenly your whole life and your experience could be turned upside down. So that's quite a frightening concept for people.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, we've talked about this on the show multiple times, but the mind is a powerful thing. So there's the whole idea of creating an entity just by thinking about it, or even if you're thinking that doll is haunted, that something would attach itself to it because it knows that you're fearful of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where people need to be careful about making that assumption. And I think it come to that conclusion, I think you do need to give some time and attention, research, investigation to the item that you're thinking is haunted, to see if actually there is something to confirm your feelings, or whether this is just a general thing or experience in your life right now, rather than the item that you're blaming it on. So I think it's helpful to have a little kind of checklist of things, making a log of what you're going through, perhaps, asking for help from a respected or trusted medium, perhaps, and then going by your own just simple equipment, really. You could use a dictaphone, start doing recordings and seeing if you capture something. EMF meters, and I know the opinions divided on paranormal apps. I think most people would agree that majority of them can't be trusted, but I think it's about taking each item and each experiment and building a whole picture from what you're experiencing, and then thinking, actually, yeah, I can link this, or I can validate that, or this experiment does keep yielding results. So I think it's important to just not rely on the feeling and the instincts, even though that can be helpful. I mean, sometimes, you might pick up an object and suddenly get this strong, overpowering feeling. But I think in terms of putting your trust that, okay, I'm right, and this isn't just because it's a spooky looking doll, or because I've seen a scary horror film about dolls or anything like that, I think you can take that a step further and do your own personal research to think, and uncover if there's something to it or not.
Mm-hmm. Now, what safeguards can somebody take, or that you would recommend collectors, both practical and spiritual, to kind of protect from something like this?
I think if somebody has has an item, brought it into their home, and they have a suspicion or a feeling, whatever the cause of that feeling might be, in the early stages, there is certainly no harm in doing some kind of prayer or words of protection, depending on your own spiritual beliefs. Obviously, that's an individual thing, but saying a few words of protection, sort of putting that boundary, sort of saying that there will be no harm, that you won't engage with anything negative, doing what you can, might not only set that tone to an energy if it is present, but it might also give you some psychological protection and feeling of control in the situation. And then, if you're somebody who can kind of make contact with like a medium or a psychic, and again, that's a personal choice, but if you're someone who believes and trusts in that, if you can find a reputable one, you can always reach out and ask that person to spend some time with the object. They can do their own prayer of protection for you, and they can even perhaps do a reading for you and confirm, actually there's nothing there, or there is. it's a tough one, because I think perhaps if there's an energy attached and it's not negative and it's something quite light and positive, there might not be any need to worry about the protection and the boundary, but you don't first. And that's why I say it wouldn't do any harm to do that at first. But if you get into the realm of feeling like actually what I have is negative or even potentially demonic, then that's a whole different thing. And then that's beyond probably what you feel like you could deal with from your own home. And you might need to call in help. You know, there are people who do blessings on objects. There are people who collect objects and will willingly take the item for you and deal with that themselves. But blessings and protection from either an outside source or yourself, if you're into, certainly might.
Okay. Now, is there anything that you would say for them not to do?
I think certainly I know it's a bit of a cliche, but not showing fear, I think. And I don't know why. I think it's just something that I've come across a few times when I've been reading about the paranormal in general and dealing with paranormal objects. It's, if you're thinking it's something negative or demonic, I think trying to be strong, keep on to hold of some strength and not kind of give in to the fear, because there is that belief, isn't there, that something negative will actually be charged by that or feel emboldened by knowing that they're having that effect on you. And I know that's easier said than done. I'm not sure I could do that if I was experiencing something that was terrifying, but I'm just saying it as something that I have heard quite a few times in different places. And then going back to what we discussed earlier, I'm not convinced that just thinking, okay, I'm going to put this item in a box in my attic will change anything. I'm not confident that destroying the item will either, because this is not something, you don't know how it's linked to the item. You don't know whether it can shift to something else. You don't know whether you're going to anger that spirit. If there is one attached, then they might not take kindly to a vessel they might have been attached to for 5, 10, 50 years even, being broken or thrown away. So I don't think throwing and destroying it, is helpful. So again, I would look to outside help from sources that you trust, reputable people that you feel like you can talk to.
Has there ever been a case that you've come across that you're very leery about doing investigating with, like just even talking to the people about the doll?
I was quite nervous writing about Roberts and Annabelle. And even my publisher, Llewellyn, that I'm releasing my book with, takes this seriously as well. And because at one point there was a discussion about using real photographs in my book. And we really, thought about that and discussed it. And in the end, we decided to have an artist do some illustrations instead, because we thought perhaps, there is those stories, like Robert not being happy about his photo being taken, and the bad luck that was associated with Annabelle and Peggy. Her photograph was supposed to have caused people very strong experience of ill health. So we really rethought that, and to that extent, we made that decision to just use some illustrations. So that gives you some kind of indication that we did want to tread care with that. So yeah, we do have pictures in the book, but not real photos of the doll, because I was aware of that, and I didn't want to unwittingly engage, draw the attention of anything negative. But I did have an experience myself when writing the book, because I reached out to a guy called Rob, and he has a podcast of his own, and he had done an experiment with a doll called Edna. He spent 2 nights, I think it was, in a hotel where it was just going to be him and this doll that was supposed to be haunted. And Rob was a bit of a skeptic, to be fair, and he didn't think that anything was going to come of it. So he spent a couple of nights holed up in this hotel room, used his paranormal equipment, his phone, and his, did various different experiments. And by the end of it, the results were recorded for his show, and were played to his audience. But he ended up feeling like, actually, I've come away feeling there is something to this doll we called Edna. And he felt uncomfortable about her to the extent that he locked her in the boot of his car when he returned from the hotel. Or that he wanted to have anything to do. Because we got talking and he knew that I was writing a book. He said, okay, why don't you have Edna? She can come and stay with you. And what started out was me saying, okay, I'll have her for a couple of weeks just to have some experience to write about in the book. Ended up with Edna staying with me permanently because Rob actually didn't want her back in the end. And I was having some really unnerving experiences myself. And when I say unnerving, I don't mean negative. I don't think the spirit attached to Edna is negative. It's supposed to be the spirit of a child, actually. But I think you can perceive something as unsettling just because it is unexpected and unknown. And with Edna, I did several experiments with her. Like I had a touch sensor ball. It's kind of like just a small ball, and it would only light up if you push it. So I placed that, I sat Edna on the shelf and I put the ball onto her legs, and I would sort of ask questions and interact, and all of a sudden, like the ball would start lighting up. And so that was really interesting. I filmed that a few times and put it on my social media. But then that became more unsettling when there would be nothing for a long period of time. And I would go to bed at night and I'd have Edna on my shelf in my room. And then I'd be woken up at 3 a.m. because the light had set itself off, and it hadn't been going, I hadn't done no experiments with it. I hadn't been anywhere near it. The house was quiet. And all of a sudden this light sensor, touch sensor light was going off in the middle of the night. So that in itself felt unsettling. You're being woken up and you're thinking, oh, is that's Edna said. And then the physical feelings around her, like sometimes really cold sensation when holding her, some kind of bigger movement around the house. My husband even saw himself, and he's a non-believer. Actually, he's much more skeptic camp than I ever was, and he was in the house shortly after we got Edna, and he himself said he was sitting there and practicing his guitar. He's a musician, and all of a sudden he saw something kind of flash by at the corner of his eye, to the extent that he got up and looked around the house thinking, is there someone that's got in? And so those kinds of experiences kept going, and that so that was kind of an unnerving thing for me, but in a way, because it helped me have that insight myself to the experience of a haunted doll. I didn't regret doing it, but it certainly was something that unnerved me and that I didn't expect to experience. But I still own Edna now. I'm still standing strong. Nothing bad's happened, and my head doesn't swivel around like horror films.
Now, it sounds like you've taken a few dolls now. Like, would you draw a line at certain activity or whatever to not take the doll?
I think so. I mean, I would never knowingly want to have a doll that was associated with. I mean, actually, that's a lie. I did it once, didn't I? The lady I told you about who had bad luck.
Mm.
It was more that her saying she had a series of bad luck. She thinks it's this doll, and I did feel a bit stupid at the time because I thought I could be inviting this into my life, and perhaps something's really going to be awful. But I think where I would draw the line is if I someone and they say, we believe this item is perhaps demonic or cursed. I think in that area is where I certainly would draw a line. There would be a boundary there for me because, well, number one, to me, it seems like common sense. Like I don't want to invite something in my life and in my home life where I have a husband and a child where something could really feel, could potentially be something that's quite terrifying if it has some really strong negative feelings and emotions and activity around it. I wouldn't want to invite that. And number two, I just don't feel like I would be somebody, as much as I've done as throw myself into this subject and researched it. I know that personally I wouldn't feel equipped to confidently deal with that, and it would just be something that probably would trouble me a lot. So that's the line I would put there. I think certainly not knowingly anyway invite anything that could potentially be demonic.
Okay. I mean, to me that makes sense. But I mean, there have been people that take it upon themselves to not necessarily protect these dolls, but keep them contained and keep them away from people. If somebody were wanting to do that, is it something that you would say is safe to do, or would you say, definitely do your research before you start doing something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if somebody feels confident, if they have background experience, they feel spiritually and mentally equipped to deal with it, and they want to, then I suppose it's up to that individual to do that. And I know that because of the way that I threw myself into the whole study of this, that I have come across people that specifically they seem just really happy, like excited to experience something, and so they seem drawn to kind of inviting like something negative just to experience it. I don't know if that's just sort of maybe the films and the Hollywood version of things kind of intrigues people. Oh, I wonder what will happen if I had a possessed doll or something. I don't know if it's that. I mean, because that would send me running the other way personally. But people are, everyone's different, and there are people out there that say, "Oh, I would adopt a negative doll," and so that it might be from a perspective of just wanting to experience that. But then there are also people who know what they're doing, who are very well versed in dealing with these things, who just want to not necessarily collect them because it's fun to collect, but actually own them. They know what they're doing and they feel good and confident in knowing how to contain it and to keep themselves safe. So it's almost like helping the people that owned it, that didn't want that object anymore, and being able to step in and remove that. So in that case, that's really valuable for people who need help.
Mm-hmm. What, if anything, do you want people to take away from this book?
I think, well, I don't want to freak your listeners out or anything and put them off going to markets and second-hand stores and everything, but I think it is possible in and I say that through my experience and research. I can't speak for other people, but I've come to the conclusion that it's possible for an object such as a doll to be haunted or spirited or cursed, whichever that happens to be, and that really that can happen at any place and at any time. So not buying a ticket to an organized paranormal event, and it's not visiting the spooky house that's empty to have this experience. This could be something you could bring into your life completely innocently. So I think for people that are open-minded to this, or who are believers, who will take this seriously, I think all I would say is, trust your instinct. I mean, I personally, I collect antique and vintage dolls, and nothing would, I'm happy to continue doing that. But I think you have to trust your instinct. And if you do get that feeling, actually, I'm getting some strong vibes off this, then it's going back to what I said earlier. It's just going through that process again. Okay, why do I feel like this? Is there another reason? And if you are convinced still that it's the item, then my advice would be to go through that list that I mentioned earlier. Go through the spending time with the item, keeping a log of events, calling in help from someone that's reputable that might be able to give you some insights, giving you a reading, buy some equipment. There are so many layers that you can do to kind of come to that validation, or perhaps not, it could end up that it's not haunted. But that's what I'd say. I it's just that owning a haunted object could happen potentially to any. I just exactly common, but I think it's an interesting idea that this, you could go out one day, buy an item that just looks cute to you or interesting, and then have this really like completely mind altering experience where, perhaps your perception of spirits and hauntings might be shifted. So it's an awareness and, trust your instinct. Maybe if you're in a shop and you pick something up you like, but you get that strong negative feeling, then maybe listen to that feeling as well.
Okay. Was there anything that shocked you or surprised you when reading this book?
It was the amount of cases that were out there. When I was telling you earlier that, obviously I had the account of Annabelle was the big trigger, like, of these kind of stories. 2015, it was the Peggy case that kind of started my obsession with haunted dolls. But I think, if I'm surprised by anything, it's that actually how many cases there are out. Probably most of your listeners are familiar with the big name Robert and Harold Peggy, but it does. You kind of do some. You realize, many people the world over have had these experiences with dolls and haunted objects, and that's quite eye opening. I think not as kind of rare as you hope for it to be. Experiences, they've had this in their life, they've had to deal with it, and it's way far beyond just the 2 or 3 names that generally headline the usual sort of paranormal books and articles. It's quite a fascinating thing to realize actually there's a whole wealth of material out there and experiences.
Now, has there been a percentage of negative versus non-negative experiences that you came across?
I'd say that, the negative ones often capture the most attention because then that grips people's attention. That kind of that plays on the whole sort of fear thing, and I can understand why. But for the most part, a lot of experiences that I looked into and read about and studied, they weren't necessarily that they were negative. There were cases where people perhaps the item, but it wasn't necessarily negative. It was just because they were having paranormal experiences that they weren't prepared to have. And, having an experience of something unsettling that you weren't expecting, that you're not used to, that makes you feel kind of uncomfortable in your own home. Those things can be perceived as negative, but it doesn't necessarily mean the energy itself had any negative intention. So I think a lot of what I've read about was that there was paranormal experiences and encounters, but that they weren't really, there wasn't just like a whole wealth of demonic cases out there, dolls or really negative spirits. There were some, and they make for good reading. That's interesting. But for a lot of cases, it was perfectly positive or calm energy, but active, what some people just aren't comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So doing the research that you have, do a lot of these cases seem more like people that just own the doll that got really attached to it? Is it more children that are getting attached and them passing away? What's your take on that?
I think it's so for every case, about like the spirit cells that are attached to the dolls. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
I think, certainly in some cases, um, it makes sense. If you have an actual child boy, such as a kind of a playful, cute-looking toy that was owned by a child, then there's every reason to think that child would have some kind of link or attachment to it, and that's certainly something. But it's not always the case. I think, going back to the reasons why an item to be haunted. It could just be that a spirit, like I said, wants to inhabit something that looks human-like. So it's not necessary they might have had a link with that item in their lifetime, but they're seeing something that they recognize as human and would rather kind of inhabit that than just something random or not having any physical link to something. I mean, there are also mysterious cases, and your question makes me think of a case in Japan. I think it was, I could be incorrect with the time. I think it was the early 1900s, and there was a case about a doll called Okiku. I don't know if you've heard of that case, and that was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
These parents had a child, a young girl, and she had a favorite doll, and she was never seen without this doll. She absolutely loved it. It was her favorite toy. And unfortunately, the child became very ill and she passed away. And the parents kept the doll in honor of the child because, this is our daughter's favorite toy. Not keeping it. They kept it on a shelf in a kind of next to the picture of their daughter in a kind of like tribute almost. After a while, the parents noticed that the doll's hair looked longer, which kind of struck them. They thought that was really odd, but they just left it and waited a while, and then they checked it again after a period of time, and it was longer again. So they asked that question. Then is our daughter who's passed on somehow affecting? Is her energy somehow affecting this, or is it something else inexplicable? And it's not a question they could get to the bottom to. But I certainly think it's possible that the child was somehow affecting the item. And as it stands, the parents eventually donated Okiku, the doll, to a temple where some monks kept hold of it. And apparently, as far as my research takes me anyway, there were monks that would do the same thing and kept a check. And apparently the doll's hair was still growing, and they were able to attest that there was truth to this. So there is that theory, was the child able to manipulate the doll with that kind of energy, or was there something completely different that's beyond our current understanding? But it was just a case that stood out in my mind when you mentioned like a child's energy sort of being around a doll that they loved. I possible, and it makes sense that would be the case in quite a few of the accounts that come up.
Now, is it Robert the doll that looked like he was aging? I know there was one case. I can't remember which one it was.
There was a case, yeah. Something tells me it wasn't Robert the doll, but it was a doll that looks similar to Robert, and I can't think of the name. But there was a case, wasn't there, where there was a doll that was found and that people were taking pictures and they noticed physical changes.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I do know the case you're referring to. My mind's drawn a blank with the name of that particular doll, but that reminds me, of what you're mentioning there, like the Japanese. It does make you wonder sometimes if there is an energy that can manipulate the material of that object. Or about that material that causes degradation. But I'm guessing that because it was so noticeable and it became so infamous about that doll that was aging, that there was something that couldn't quite be explained with natural means. So to think that it could potentially be changing the.
Now, have you, in all the cases that you come across, is there a certain material that is more haunted than others, like porcelain versus rag versus plastic?
I don't think so. No, from everything that I've learned, I think it can literally be anything. And in a way, that makes sense because if a doll can be haunted, then any object could be. So like I mentioned earlier, whether an antique heirloom with the family passed down, be a rich piece of jewelry or an antique wardrobe. There's something, items can have energy. I don't think it's limited to that physical material. I think that if a spirit is drawn to something for a reason, I don't think it affect on what that objectives. So, about Porcelain being haunted, but I have certainly come across like Raggedy Ann type well and puppets and sorts. So I don't think it's a one kind from what I've done.
Okay. All right. Well, we are getting close to the end of the show, so I want to give you the chance to tell everybody where they can find you, find the book. The mic's all yours.
Okay. So, the first thing I'd want to say, I'm still about haunted dolls, that I can reach out, had an experience myself that you're interested in me. I'd love to hear from me. My book is called A First Collection of Haunted Dolls. It'll be out the 25th of September in America. Over here in the UK, out in early. So, and it does continue use with like recognize from some paranormal shows, and also a lot of writing that are more unknown. Hopefully, you guys will find. So you can get a collection of haunted dolls, your stores, or then it'll be available in ebook and version. And you can look me up. I am on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Look me up, Fiona Dodwell, author, and I should come up. I'd love to connect with some of you and hear about your own experiences.
All right, Fiona, thank you so much for coming on. And I will definitely be pushing this book because it's one of those things that it is not talked about as much compared to other things in the paranormal. So,
yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
All right, folks, make sure you check out Fiona's book, A Cursed, doll collection. Sorry about that. A Cursed Collection of Haunted Dolls. Definitely something that is not really talked about very often on a lot of shows or whatever, or even done on the TV shows. Those cursed dolls, haunted dolls are one of those things that is not talked about as much as other things in the paranormal. Something I did want to bring up is we did do a poll before doing the recording of the show, and we asked, if a doll moved an inch every night, would you keep it or curb it? And the answers were keep it, cleanse it, contain it, curb it. And it was a 50-50 break on people that would cleanse it or people that would curb it. Nobody had an answer for keep it or contain it. So that was a really interesting poll, and I hope you guys are enjoying all of these. We hope to have more answers from all of you because it's definitely an engaging conversation. So make sure you're checking out everything that we post. We post them on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. There are a couple others that we're on. Engage with us. Tell us what you guys think, because just because we're bringing this information to you doesn't mean that there aren't other opinions out there. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, no matter where you're listening or watching. Until next week, where you'll find us same time, same channel. My name is Justin. Talk to you guys later.